The Navy called the PBY Catalina the most capable patrol aircraft in the American arsenal. That was the official position in 1941, stated plainly in Bureau of Aeronautics assessments and echoed in the fleet directives that assigned Catalina squadrons to every theater the United States entered when the war began. The Catalina could fly 2,520 miles without landing. It could carry bombs, depth charges, and torpedoes. It could land on open ocean to rescue downed airmen when no other aircraft could. It could hunt submarines, spot enemy fleets, and remain airborne for hours that no land-based patrol aircraft could approach. The men who flew it were told they were operating the most versatile aircraft the Navy possessed, a machine that had no operational peer in the patrol and reconnaissance role. The recruitment pipeline that filled Catalina squadrons described a mission of extraordinary importance, finding the enemy, protecting the convoys, turning the tide of the submarine war. What the Bureau of Aeronautics assessments did not include was the operational loss rate that documented what flying the Catalina in combat actually produced. Between December 1941 and August 1945, the Navy and its allied partners lost 534 PBY Catalinas to all causes: combat, weather, mechanical failure, and operational accident. Of the approximately 2,000 Catalinas that flew in American service during the war, more than 1 in 4 was destroyed before the war ended. The crews who flew them encountered an aircraft that cruised at 125 miles per hour, slower than most of the aircraft that would try to kill them, slower than most of the submarines they were hunting, incapable of meaningful evasion once an enemy fighter had acquired it as a target. They flew patrols lasting 18 hours. They flew those patrols alone, over open ocean, out of range of any assistance, in weather that the pre-war test reports had assessed as manageable and that the operational records described differently. They found enemy fleets and submarines and downed airmen and burning ships in distress, and they reported what they found, and some of them came home and some of them did not. And the official assessments of the Catalina's versatility did not adequately account for the specific cost of what versatility demanded from the men providing it. That was what the Bureau of Aeronautics said. Here is what the patrol logs and the action reports and the survivor accounts said. Start with the machine, because no honest accounting of what Catalina crews endured can begin without the machine's specific physical character. The way it looked, the way it moved, and the way its design imposed conditions on the men inside it that no official specification sheet captured. The PBY-5A Catalina, the amphibious variant that was the most common model in service by 1942 and 1943, was a parasol monoplane flying boat, a configuration that sounds immediately archaic in the context of the high-performance aircraft the war was simultaneously producing. She could not run. She could not climb above the threat. She could not fight her way out of an engagement with a fighter. Her defensive armament, 2.50 caliber machine guns in waist blisters on either side of the after fuselage, a .30 caliber in the bow turret, and a .30 caliber firing aft from a tunnel position in the bottom of the hull, was adequate against other slow aircraft and useless against a Zero or a Focke-Wulf 19 making a proper gunnery pass. What she could do, and what no other aircraft available to the Navy in 1941 and most of 1942 could do, was stay airborne for 18 to 24 hours over featureless ocean and find things. Her wing measured 104 feet from tip to tip, mounted above the fuselage on a pylon structure that gave the aircraft its characteristic silhouette. 2 Pratt & Whitney R-1830 twin Wasp radial engines, each developing 1,200 horsepower, were mounted in the wing leading edge. Her hull was a marine hull, designed to land on and take off from water, and it was watertight, and it was the shape of a boat hull, because that is precisely what it was. She measured 63 feet and 10 inches from bow to tail. She carried a crew of 7 to 9 men, depending on the mission configuration. Her maximum takeoff weight was 35,420 pounds. Her cruise speed was 125 miles per hour. Her service ceiling was 13,000 feet, lower than most twin-engine patrol aircraft in any air force, far lower than the single-engine fighters that would attack her. The men who flew her understood this trade-off with the specific clarity that comes from being the thing that cannot run. The interior of a PBY-5A during a Pacific patrol in 1943 was a particular physical environment that the crew spent between 12 and 24 hours inhabiting without the option of leaving it. The hull was aluminum. Aluminum conducts temperature. In the tropics, at low altitude before the aircraft climbed to patrol altitude, the interior of the hull in direct sunlight reached temperatures that the crews described in post-war accounts as comparable to the inside of a car parked in August. Except that the car analogy fails, because you could leave a car. In the hull of a Catalina, at cruise altitude over the Pacific, the ambient temperature depended entirely on the outside air and the solar loading on the aluminum skin, and at 5,000 feet in tropical air, it ran between 85 and 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the main cabin, with the galley area, a small compartment forward of the waist blisters, where a hot plate was mounted for food preparation, adding its own heat to the enclosed space. The noise was a separate category of experience from the heat, and it operated simultaneously with it. Two R183 zero radial engines running at cruise power setting generated a continuous broadband noise in the frequency range of 80 to 95 decibels throughout the interior of the aircraft. This was not the sharp, impulsive noise of a gun firing. It was sustained, constant, present at every moment of a 20-hour patrol, penetrating the headphones the crew wore for communication, permeating the aluminum hull structure, conducted into the seats and the floorboards as vibration that registered in the body simultaneously with the sound registered in the ears. Men on long patrols learned to communicate by lip reading during watch periods when the interphone was occupied with navigation calls or contact reports. The shouted conversation that substituted for normal speech in the hull of a working Catalina was not a workaround. It was the primary communication mode for most of the crew, for most of each patrol. After 24 hours in that environment, the hearing operated on a different register. The silence after engines off at the mooring or the ramp was not experienced as quiet. It was experienced as the absence of a presence so constant that its removal felt physically wrong. The watch rotation on a Catalina patrol was shaped by the patrol duration in a way that produced a specific form of fatigue that no shore-based medical study had accurately modeled. A standard Pacific patrol in 1943 launched before dawn, typically between 0300 and 0500, to maximize the daylight patrol hours over the search area. The crew of 8 or 9 men was divided into watch sections for the flight positions. 2 pilots rotated at the controls, a navigator maintained the aircraft's position, 2 or 3 radio men maintained communication watch and operated the radar, and the waist gunners and bow observer rotated through their positions. The rotation was theoretically 4 hours on and 4 hours off. The off-watch period in practice was not rest in any meaningful sense. The off-watch crewman moved from his station to one of the rest positions available in the Catalina's hull, a folding bunk in the after compartment, a space on the tunnel gunner's pad, a position propped against the aircraft's internal structure, and attempted to sleep in an aluminum tube traveling at 125 miles per hour through tropical air, vibrating at the frequency of 2 radial engines, with the temperature between 85 and 100 degrees, with the interphone traffic audible through the headset he had to keep partially on in case a contact report required all hands. Men slept in this environment the way men sleep in any environment where sleep is the only alternative to greater exhaustion, imperfectly, partially, with a quality of rest that accumulated a deficit across the patrol hours that no 4-hour rotation could fully reverse. After 16 hours, both pilots were operating on total sleep in the preceding 24 hours that the Navy's own aviation medicine studies of 1943 and 1944 identified as producing measurable degradation in complex task performance. After 20 hours, the degradation was not subtle. It expressed itself in the specific ways that fatigue expresses itself in aircraft operations: slightly delayed responses, a narrowing of attentional focus that missed peripheral information, a reduced threshold for confirmation bias in search operations, where the mind that had been looking for a submarine for 18 hours was prone to seeing one in any wave shadow that approximated the right size and shape. A tired crew on a long patrol over featureless water in low visibility was not an ineffective crew. They were trained and disciplined and professional. They were also physiologically impaired in ways that the operational tempo the patrol mission required did not accommodate, and that the official doctrine governing patrol frequency and duration had not adequately integrated into its planning assumptions. The numbers that define what Catalina operations actually demanded deserve their concentrated examination here, because they reveal the gap between the mission the Bureau of Aeronautics described and the mission the crews performed. In the Atlantic Theater in 1942 and 1943, PBY Catalinas assigned to VP squadrons operating from Bermuda, the Azores, Iceland, and the maritime provinces of Canada were flying patrols averaging between 14 and 18 hours in duration. The patrols covered the Central Atlantic convoy routes, searching for U-boats operating on the surface to recharge batteries or attacking convoys that the submarines had located by radio intercept. A Catalina detecting a surface submarine had a narrow window for attack. A U-boat crash diving from surface patrol depth could be underwater in 35 seconds, and a depth charge dropped on water, where a submarine had been 10 seconds ago, was statistically unlikely to achieve lethal proximity. The mathematics of anti-submarine attack from a Catalina demanded that the pilot see the submarine, position the aircraft for the attack run, descend to attack altitude of 50 feet, run in at 125 miles per hour, and release the depth charges at a spacing calculated to straddle the submerging submarine's expected position, all within a window measured in seconds from first sighting to optimal release point. In daylight, against a U-boat that had not detected the approaching aircraft, this was achievable. The approach to low altitude was manageable, the attack geometry was trainable, and the depth charge patterns that the Atlantic patrol squadrons had developed through operational experience by mid-1943 were reasonably effective. At night, in reduced visibility, against a U-boat that was alerted by radar or lookout and beginning to dive, it was something else entirely. Night patrol operations against the U-boat were the specific mission context that revealed most completely what it cost to fly a Catalina in the Atlantic in 1943. The Catalina carried the ASV Mark II radar from 1942 onward, a metric wavelength radar that could detect a surface submarine at ranges between 5 and 8 miles under good conditions. The radar operated from a dome above the fuselage, was maintained by the radio man, and required interpretation by a crew that had been flying for however many hours had passed since takeoff. A radar contact in the darkness over the Atlantic at hour 15 of an 18-hour patrol, with both pilots operating on fragmented sleep, and the radio man, on his second consecutive watch period, was processed and acted on by men who were managing the cognitive demand of a combat approach in the physiological state that 15 hours of patrol had produced. The Lié light, a powerful searchlight mounted on the Catalina's wing that could illuminate a surfaced submarine at close range during the attack run, was available on aircraft operating in the Atlantic by 1942. The light allowed night attacks that the darkness would otherwise have prevented. It also illuminated the attacking aircraft for any anti-aircraft gunner on the submarine's deck, made the aircraft a visible target at the moment of maximum vulnerability, low altitude, committed to the attack run, unable to maneuver significantly without breaking off, and produced a specific category of casualties among Atlantic patrol crews that the statistics record as combat losses and that the specific circumstances of Lié light attacks make comprehensible in human terms. You flew in at 50 feet above the water at night, and you turned on the light and you found out what was there. The specific incident that reaches into the center of what Catalina operations cost in the Atlantic occurred on the night of July the 28th, 1943, and the crew of a PBY 5A from VP 84, operating from Meeks Field in Iceland. The aircraft, Bureau number 08107, named Black Cat by her crew in the informal tradition of Catalinas, painted in non-reflective black for night operations, was on the 19th hour of a patrol covering the convoy lanes south of Iceland when the radar operator, aviation radio man, second class Donald Kress of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, detected a contact at approximately 6 miles. The contact was surface. The contact was not moving. A stationary surface contact in the convoy lanes at 0200 was almost certainly a submarine recharging batteries on the surface. The pilot, Lieutenant Junior Grade William Fenimore of Columbus, Ohio, brought the aircraft down from 1,500 feet to the attack altitude of 50 feet over approximately 4 minutes, tracking the contact on radar as it resolved into a definite shape at closer range. At 1 mile, Fenimore activated the lee light. The light illuminated a surfaced U-boat, U-461, a Type 14 supply submarine, in the process of transferring fuel to 2 operational U-boats alongside her. The scene the light revealed was not in any training manual. 3 submarines on the surface simultaneously, in physical contact with each other. Approximately 150 German sailors on the decks, some of them already reacting to the light, manning the anti-aircraft weapons that a Type 14 carried in more substantial battery than a standard attack submarine. Fenimore flew through the anti-aircraft fire, released 6 Mark 47 depth charges across the contact, and pulled up over the submarines at an altitude that crew accounts from that night describe as low enough to see the individual men on the deck below. U-461 was sunk. 2 British Sunderlands from 201 Squadron that arrived in response to the contact report sank the other 2 submarines over the following 2 hours. It was one of the only occasions in the Atlantic War when 3 submarines were sunk in a single engagement. Bureau number 08107 returned to Meeks Field with anti-aircraft damage to the hull and 1 engine running rough from fragment penetration of the cowling. She had been airborne for 22 hours and 40 minutes. Kress had been at the radar for 14 of those hours. Fenimore had been at the controls, trading with his co-pilot for the entire patrol. They were given a day off and flew again 48 hours later. The Pacific Theater imposed a different version of the same essential reality onto Catalina crews, with the addition of an enemy fighter threat that the Atlantic, with its Focke-Wulf Condors operating at extended range and not specifically tasked with hunting patrol aircraft, did not present with the same systematic lethality. A Japanese Zero, the Mitsubishi A6M in its variants, flew at a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour and had a service ceiling above 32,000 feet. A PBY-5A flew at 179 miles per hour at best speed and had a ceiling of 13,000 feet. These numbers are not comparable in the sense that any tactical analysis might use the word comparable. They describe 2 aircraft that occupied different categories of flight performance, and when one encountered the other in contested airspace, the outcome of the encounter was defined by those numbers with a precision that left almost no room for pilot skill or crew determination to alter the fundamental geometry. Catalina crews operating in the Philippines in December 1941 and January 1942 encountered this geometry in the most direct terms available. The Japanese air campaign that accompanied the invasion of the Philippines included active hunting of American patrol aircraft because the Catalina's search mission was a direct threat to Japanese operational security. An aircraft that could find a fleet at 700 miles range was an aircraft the fleet's air cover needed to destroy before it could report. The 2 Catalina patrol squadrons operating in the Philippines at the outbreak of the war lost aircraft to Japanese fighter interception in the first weeks of operations at rates that made sustained daylight patrol in contested airspace unsustainable. The response was the Black Cat. The Black Cat program, formerly the painting of Catalinas in non-specular black paint for exclusive night operations, was developed from operational necessity rather than doctrinal innovation. The crews who first began flying their patrols exclusively at night, avoiding the daylight hours when Japanese fighters controlled the airspace, were not following a Bureau directive. They were surviving. The institutional recognition of what the crews had improvised came later. The program it produced systematically modified Catalinas, stripped of unnecessary equipment to extend range and endurance, fitted with improved radar and the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, in addition to their standard depth charge load, flying exclusively at night against Japanese shipping in the Southwest Pacific, was one of the most effective anti-shipping campaigns the Navy conducted in the theater. It was also an operational existence that imposed specific costs on the men who flew it. Night operations in the Pacific differed from Atlantic night patrols in one environmental characteristic that the Pacific theater's geography imposed and the Atlantic did not: weather that the radar could not see through and that the Mark I human eyeball at 50 feet altitude over black water on an overcast night could not read until it was inside it. Pacific tropical weather produced convective storms, thunderstorms with updrafts and downdrafts measured in thousands of feet per minute, that could be visible on radar and still could not be accurately assessed for their interior conditions from outside them. Catalina crews flying night missions through the Solomons in 1942 and 1943, through the Philippines in 1944 and 1945, encountered weather that the aircraft was rated to penetrate, and that the aircraft's rated capability did not fully represent what penetrating it actually felt like. The vertical acceleration loads in severe turbulence in a large flying boat are experienced differently from the same loads in a smaller aircraft. The Catalina's wing, at 104 feet of span, flexed in severe turbulence in a way that was visible from the cockpit, and that the structural engineers who designed it had calculated was within safe limits. The pilots who watched the wingtips deflect upward and downward by several feet. In the worst turbulence, were not consulting the structural calculations during the event. They were managing the aircraft's attitude with the controls available to them, which in the worst turbulence were providing limited authority over what the aircraft was doing, and they were waiting for the turbulence to end, which it eventually did, or the aircraft was lost in it, and the patrol record contained one more entry in the category of missing. The missing category in Catalina operations deserves specific acknowledgement because it represents a particular form of loss that the combat loss statistics obscure. An aircraft lost in combat, shot down by a fighter or anti-aircraft fire, produced wreckage, sometimes survivors in the water, sometimes documentation of the loss from enemy records or the witness accounts of other aircraft in the area. An aircraft that failed to return from a patrol over open ocean in bad weather left nothing. The crew was listed as missing. The aircraft was listed as missing. The search, if one was conducted, covered hundreds of square miles of featureless water and found nothing because there was nothing findable. The patrol record showed the aircraft departing and not returning, and the cause of loss was entered as unknown. Between 1942 and 1945, 237 Catalinas were lost to causes listed as unknown or operational: weather, navigational error, mechanical failure, spatial disorientation over featureless water at night. These losses were not combat losses in the formal sense. They were the cost of the mission itself, of flying long patrols over open ocean in all weather conditions, in an aircraft whose performance envelope was exceeded regularly by what the operational requirement demanded of it. These 237 aircraft and their crews are the losses that the recruitment material's description of versatility did not account for. The fatigue accumulated over months of patrol operations produced a specific deterioration that the patrol squadron's medical officers documented and that the operational tempo consistently prevented from being adequately addressed. A patrol crew completing 3 patrols per week, the standard operational requirement for VP squadrons in the Pacific in 1943 and 1944, was spending between 42 and 60 hours per week airborne, at the noise levels, temperatures, and sustained alertness demands that Catalina operations imposed, in addition to the maintenance duties, briefings, debriefings, and administrative requirements that filled the hours between patrols. The total hours of cognitive and physical demand per week exceeded anything the aviation medicine studies of the period identified as sustainable for maintaining peak operational performance. The men sustained it anyway, because the missions had to be flown. There was a specific category of mission that the Catalina performed throughout the war, that the patrol and anti-submarine narratives tend to overshadow in historical accounts, but that the crews who flew it describe with a consistency suggesting it was the mission they thought about most: rescue. The Catalina was the primary rescue aircraft of the Pacific War. When a carrier pilot ditched after a strike, when a B-17 crew surviving a crash landing was floating in rafts 100 miles from any land, when a submarine could not surface in contested waters to retrieve a man in the water, the Catalina was called. She could land on open ocean when other aircraft could not. She could take aboard survivors, provide medical attention in the after compartment where the bunk and the first aid equipment were, and fly them to safety. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Catalinas rescued an estimated 3,000 downed airmen and other survivors from Pacific waters. This is a documented figure from VP squadron records, and it understates the total because many rescues went unrecorded in the operational confusion of frontline operations. The rescue mission imposed a specific operational requirement that the patrol mission did not: the open ocean landing. Landing a PBY-5A on open ocean, not a harbor, not a lagoon, not a protected anchorage, but open Pacific swells, required a judgment of sea state, swell period, and wind direction that the pilot executed at low altitude in conditions that the gauges in the cockpit did not measure, and that the eyes had to assess correctly on the first attempt, because the second attempt sometimes did not happen. A Catalina landing in 6-foot swells on a heading that put the swell period wrong relative to the hull could be destroyed on touchdown, the hull slamming into the back face of a wave rather than riding up and over it, the deceleration forces tearing the aircraft apart or inverting it in the water. Pilots who had done it described it as a commitment made on imperfect information, in a situation where the consequences of the wrong assessment were immediate and final. They did it because the man in the water required it. The rescue operations in contested airspace added the fighter threat to the sea state problem in a combination that produced the specific category of loss that VP squadron records document as rescue casualties. Catalinas lost while attempting or completing rescue operations, some to Japanese fighters who pursued the aircraft during its low-altitude approach to the survivor, some to the landing itself in deteriorated sea conditions, some to the extended time on the water while taking aboard survivors that allowed an enemy aircraft or surface vessel to find the stationary flying boat before it could get airborne again. A fully loaded Catalina on open ocean, taking aboard survivors in a swell, with an injured man being managed in the after compartment, and the pilot assessing the wave period for a takeoff run, and the radar operator monitoring for contacts, was not a machine in its optimal configuration. It was a machine at the absolute limit of what it was designed to do, operated by men who were there because someone in the water required them to be. The institutional changes that followed the war's end tell their own partial story about what 4 years of Catalina operations had revealed. The Navy's post-war patrol aviation program moved decisively to land-based aircraft, the P-2, V Neptune, the P-5, M Marlin, that were faster, had greater range, and were armed with more capable weapon systems than the Catalina's wartime configuration. The open ocean landing capability that had made the Catalina irreplaceable for rescue operations was progressively transferred to helicopters as rotary wing technology matured. The 24-hour patrol endurance that had been the Catalina's defining operational characteristic became achievable in aircraft that flew at 300 miles per hour instead of 125, reducing the crew exposure time for the same search coverage. The specific combination of demands that Catalina's service imposed, the duration, the noise, the heat, the fatigue, the sea state landings, the fighter threat operating environment, the rescue missions flown in conditions that no operational planning document had specified, because no operational planning document could have anticipated the specific man in the specific piece of water requiring a specific aircraft to come down to him, was not replicated in the post-war era because the technology made it unnecessary. The men who had provided it went home. One of them was aviation machinist's mate first class Harold Beatty of Tacoma, Washington. Beatty was 24 years old when he reported to VP-11 at Pearl Harbor in February 1943, assigned as flight engineer on a PBY-5A designated P-11, Black Cat configuration, assigned to night anti-shipping and rescue operations in the Solomon Islands Theater. He was aboard for 11 months of combat operations. 67 patrols, the squadron record reported, before he was rotated stateside in January 1944. They found 5 survivors in 2 rafts after 40 minutes of searching, located them by the flash of a signal mirror when P-11's search track brought the aircraft within 3 miles. Whitmore landed in a 4-foot swell on a heading that Beatty later said he had thought was wrong from the approach, but that Whitmore had assessed from a factor Beatty had not seen from his flight engineer's position: a secondary swell running across the primary that altered the effective period. The landing was clean. The 5 men were aboard in 11 minutes. A Japanese destroyer was detected on the radar at 14 miles and closing during the loading. On the night of November 14, 1943, P-11 was diverted from an anti-shipping patrol in the slot to respond to a position report from a B-24 crew that had ditched approximately 90 miles south of Bougainville after battle damage from a Japanese fighter. The position placed the survivors in waters that Japanese surface patrols regularly covered. The decision to attempt the rescue was the pilot's, Lieutenant James Whitmore of Portland, Oregon, and Whitmore made it without significant deliberation. There were men in the water. P-11 went for them. Whitmore got P-11 airborne before the destroyer reached effective gun range. The takeoff run in the swell was long enough that Beatty had begun calculating in the way that flight engineers calculate without being entirely aware they are doing it, whether the remaining water before the next wave crest was enough for liftoff speed. It was, by a margin that Beatty described in a 1979 interview with the Naval Institute Oral History Program, as not a comfortable one. P-11 returned to Guadalcanal with 5 B-24 crewmen and 2 holes in the hull from what the damage inspection the following day determined were rifle-caliber rounds fired from the destroyer's deck crew during the takeoff roll at extreme range. He said that, in his experience, the difference between an engine that was going to be reliable when you needed it and an engine that was not had nothing to do with how the engine looked from the outside. He said you learned the specific sound each engine made when it was right. And you didn't sign off on one that didn't sound right, because somewhere down the line, someone was going to depend on it being right, and they might not be in a position to deal with it not being right. She said she understood he was talking about buses. She said she also understood he was not only talking about buses. Beatty returned to Tacoma after the war and worked for 31 years as a mechanic for Pierce County Public Transit, maintaining buses. He retired in 1975. He attended VP-11 reunions irregularly, twice in the 1950s, 3 times in the 1980s, when the squadron's veterans were old enough that the reunions had taken on the character of occasions not to miss. He died in 1991 at the age of 72. His daughter, in an interview conducted for a Tacoma Historical Society project in 1998, described visiting her father once at the transit yard and watching him inspect a bus engine with a thoroughness that seemed disproportionate to the requirement. She asked him why he was so careful about it.